Good morning, everybody. The seminar has gone live, and it's great to see people joining us. The people you can see on the gallery panel are your panelists today to help you talk through and learn from how to avoid the pitfalls of doing a business overseas. So I'll just wait for everybody to join us before we kick off and introduce the panel and give them a chance to have a voice this morning. I hope everybody's having a good morning. What day is it today? It's Tuesday. Always good to know which day of the week we're on, isn't it? Tuesday, it's 10:30. Right, I'll just do some basic introductions then. My name is Liz Maher, and I've got the absolute pleasure this morning to be hosting this discussion. For those of you who already know me, I'm sorry, it's me again. Those of you who don't know me, as I say, I'm a director of a VAT consultancy practice based here in Cardiff and called Centurion VAT. Today is not about VAT, but obviously you can see why I was interested to listen to the discussion and the comments, because a lot of my client base are involved in working overseas in terms of opening up markets. It tends to be in terms of importing and exporting, but there's a much wider context to doing business overseas. And it's really important that the Welsh economy and businesses such as yourself have the opportunity to explore and expand your markets. And I know from looking at the attendance list that a lot of you are already involved in that area. So hopefully today, whether you're interested on the HR side or on the business process side or in the finance side in terms of managing risk and exposure, there'll be something for you to engage with. Now, the session is recorded. And we are going to encourage you to join in on the chat box and use the question and answer to put any questions that you've got in there. There are no polls that we're running today. This is very much, we're trying to make this as interactive as we can. So please do, as I say, use the question and answer box. Sarah from Chambers Wales will be facilitating that discussion. I'll come to Sarah periodically through the session to see what sort of questions that we've got out there. If I can ask you directly as delegates, though, and listening in, what are your top tips in terms of, well, what are the issues that you've come across? And that'll help feed the discussion as our expert panel are talking today. So, and again, if you want to share your contact details, I know there's a number of diverse organisations from Vortex and the Internet of Things to Frio in terms of the supply of insulation products for insulin, cooler bags for insulin. There's a really diverse. We might even have a lawyer from the Middle East sitting in on this as well. So it's really diverse. So if we can all learn from others' experiences, that would be really good. So I'm Welsh, I'm female, and I can talk for Britain. So I'm going to make sure that the other people who have joined us with their expertise have the chance to say hello and bring to initially the discussion what I sort of thought was, well, what's the top thing? What's the most important thing? So I'm just going to move across the sort of section. Can I, Alex, you've popped up on my screen. Say hello, give us a little bit of a bio back of what you do at Capital Law, and what's your top tip or your top issue?
Thanks, Liz, and hi everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. So as Liz has mentioned, I work for Capital Law, so I am an employment and immigration lawyer here at Capital. I've been working here for 12 years and I specialise in immigration, but also in international working, global mobility, if you like. So we regularly advise clients on issues involved with both remote working internationally, but also the considerations for people who want to send employees abroad, perhaps to set up a new business. And I think the key issues come up time and time again, and they're quite often forgotten. Obviously, if you're wanting to send somebody abroad to establish a physical presence, that makes absolute practical sense. But there's often maybe a misunderstanding or perhaps the practical legal issues go unnoticed, if you like. So it's really important to understand what those are, because they could have quite a big impact on your decision to send somebody abroad. Obviously, they're not all, they can be overcome, and there's ways of dealing with these issues. But so I think in terms of my top tip, it's very difficult to narrow it down to just one thing. There are a range of different things. But if I was to give you one or two key messages for sending people to work abroad, then obviously ignoring the fact that you have to make sure they've got the right to work in that country. So that's obviously goes without saying. I think that the two main things would be tax and social security. This is what my clients are mainly concerned with. I don't advise on tax, but I have a general understanding. Huge questions over how much tax do I pay? How much social security do I pay? Because that varies enormously from country to country and can be much, much higher than the national insurance contributions that employers pay here in the UK. And where do I pay it? Do I pay it in the UK? Do I pay it abroad? Can I continue to keep that employee on the UK payroll? So tax is a huge area, social security as well. And then obviously it would be remiss of me not to mention employment law. So when somebody is sent abroad, something that people will very often overlook, and understandably so, they will usually be sent abroad and they will have their contract of employment with the UK company, which will be governed by UK law. Obviously, that's where the employer is based. But what people don't necessarily realise is when that person starts working abroad, in most cases, from day one of that work in a different jurisdiction, they will benefit from the mandatory labour law protections in that country. So what does that mean? Well, it's if that country has legal minimums, for example, for overtime rates of pay, or the number of hours that somebody can work over and above their normal hours, and those minimums are lower. So the minimum number of overtime hours is lower than what might be in their contract in the UK, or the rate of pay that they should be paid is higher than they are normally paid in the UK, then they're entitled to that higher rate of pay for the time that they're working abroad. They benefit from that protection in that local jurisdiction. And as I say, many people don't realise this, and you have that dilemma then. Do you bring that to the employee's attention? Do you basically comply with the overseas labour laws while that person is there, or do you just rely on the contract and hope that nobody notices, which is obviously comes with its risks? So yeah, there's lots of different areas, and I would always recommend seeking local tax and labour law advice before sending employees abroad.
Yeah, I think that last point you've made is really important, because there is the danger. I've seen it a lot of times where we've got US companies coming into the UK. They assume that all the laws on VAT apply equally in France and Germany as they did in the UK. And that's when we were in the single market, and it didn't follow. And it's even more complicated now. So I think and having a global network for you to be able to access those questions. I know there's Liz is on from Fike Safety as an HR manager, so I'll be interested to see what sort of practical issues that Liz has had as a business operating in there. I'm going to come to Oliver now, because for me it seemed that there were a couple of core issues. There were people, which Alex is going to talk to, but there's managing the overall backdrop of business risk, which is where Oliver at Atradius, you've got that expertise. So say hello, Oliver, and give us a little pen picture of managing business risk issues.
Thanks, Liz, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, my name's Oliver Ford. I'm from Atradius and working here in Cardiff Bay, and I've been with Atradius for about 12 years, 14 years, in fact, sorry. And over those 14 years, I've really been focused on supporting businesses, primarily multinational businesses, with their endeavours in international trade. And so this topic of discussion is very interesting for me. Yeah, over the past few years, I've had a range of roles within Atradius that have given me some insight into the ways of international trade. I started out here in Cardiff, but then quickly moved across to London, and was head of new business and marketing in our London operations, and then moved across to Hong Kong, where I was responsible there for our operations across 12 different markets, from Dubai in the west across to Japan in the east. And you can imagine the plethora of different business cultures and practices that exist in that part of the world. So it's given me a fairly unique insight, and certainly from from a global trade perspective, what we've seen over recent years is some very serious disruption to the general order of things. There are multiple factors that are contributing to that. We know about increasing protectionism. Of course, we've had the US and China trade war, which continues to play out. Brexit for us here in the UK, and of course the pandemic as a global phenomenon, and those things added together have really contributed to an uncertain market environment. And now, what we've seen from that is, in essence, a global recession. We've seen a tightening of supply chain issues and delays, trade barriers that didn't exist previously as well, of course. And a lot of uncertainty about how to navigate those choppy waters. Now, I'm an optimist at heart. There's uncertainty, but there's also opportunity in that, and businesses that are able to adapt themselves to that change, very fast changing environment, are going to be well suited to thrive in the current context. So. What are we seeing? I think, and what should we learn from the past few years? I think in essence, it's to expect the unexpected and to prepare for all eventualities. And of course, what we know is that the business needs and consumer needs within all trade sectors are tending to change and shift. So the tectonic plates are moving, and so it's really important for service providers to be agile enough to adapt to those changing circumstances. We also all know about the government support that has been provided over the last couple of years. We know about it in the UK. It was also provided across the European continent, and that government support has provided, it's fair to say, a relatively artificial trading environment where businesses have been able to survive based on government support. Now, what we're going to see as that governmental support tapers away is an increase in business insolvencies. Businesses that have been previously kept going, or so-called zombie companies, will shore up, and we'll see defaults, and that presents a risk to businesses that are trading on credit. We'll also see, in general, businesses that have been struggling over this really difficult period to sustain their business as it continues to change. So we are expecting here at Atradius the calm waters that we've seen in the business environment to become a lot more choppy in 2022. And indeed, insolvencies are predicted to rise by 70% year on year in the UK, which is very, very significant. And indeed, that's 33% above the pre-pandemic level. So it's something to be concerned about and keep an eye out for. And that's the business that we're in at Atradius, supporting companies to trade safely and ensure that if they don't get paid, that they can be they're not financially damaged. Yeah,
I think that's really important, because there's no profit in a sale that doesn't pay. So we really need to manage risk. Now, Kellsey, in terms of, we've talked about people in terms of Alex's input there. We've talked about the risk management backdrop. Your expertise is around more contractual arrangements in terms of dealing with business responsibilities, whether that's intellectual property rights or the dreaded GDPR regimes. Say hello and give us a flavour of the sort of concern, the key concerns that you're picking up in those sorts of sectors. Over to you, Kellsey.
Thanks, Liz. So yes, hi everyone. I'm a commercial solicitor at Capital Law. As Liz mentions, I do sort of a breadth of general commercial work. So that includes advising, negotiating on commercial contracts, whether that's overseas contract purchase and sale of services, goods, intellectual property licensing, data sharing arrangements, and as Liz says, everyone's favourite topic, GDPR. As a sort of core specialism, I specialise in intellectual property, and I think one of the key factors to draw out of today and what I hope to bring mostly today is the issue we see with businesses all the time trading overseas and in the UK to do with who owns their IP. It becomes a much bigger issue generally when businesses go for investment or they go for an acquisition or a sale. Due diligence, unfortunately, pulls out all the things that perhaps on a day-to-day operating business you haven't suffered with. So from an IP ownership perspective, one of the key things that we see a lot with trading internationally is where a business will engage a third party overseas to either do manufacturing for them or to do development work, trial work for them, and they don't have any contractual relationship with them. And that opens up a number of risks, a number of issues, but two sort of key risks there is disclosure of confidential information. Disclosure of confidential information without a contract or without an express contractual obligation can really jeopardize your ability to protect IP, depending on whether you've got patentable technologies. And it's something which sometimes is an oversight, because businesses will have initial engagement with businesses to try and suss out whether they want to work with them, and inadvertently end up disclosing sort of confidential information that really needs to be buttoned down from the beginning. So a key point there is to always have a non-disclosure agreement or a confidentiality agreement right at the beginning, before those conversations even begin. Aside from that is also, the nuance in intellectual property law is that if you are engaging a third party to develop something for you, that may be an adaptation or an improvement to IP you've already created in the UK, but then you want to exploit in overseas markets, is that the laws around IP will differ depending on which jurisdiction you are in. And that's something that I think is a real common pitfall for businesses, is to not think that IP law and IP registration is a universal topic. It is different in different jurisdictions. So, for example, in China, the formalities are quite strict around registering licenses, registering sort of assignments of ownership of IP, and to fall foul of some of those things could mean that your IP isn't enforceable. So hopefully today we can chat through some of those points. And again, as Liz says, any sort of real life examples you've had, particularly for software businesses is a real prime example where software businesses will engage third parties to create code for them. They don't have a contract with them, and unfortunately 5 years down the line they find that this piece of code isn't owned by them, and it's trying to pick up the pieces and put the puzzle back together. So yeah, I'd say my message on the common pitfalls is, as much as everyone probably doesn't want to have contracts coming out of their ears, contracts right at the beginning are absolutely vital to protect IP and confidential information.
That's really helpful. Good. Thanks everybody for giving us a kickstart to the discussion today. I noticed that there's a number of people on the call. So for example, I'm thinking Lawrence in terms of Poet Systems and the managing cloud software, that point you made. I'm wondering if that caused any concerns for those people, or indeed on Vortex for the Internet of Things, managing software. For those of you who are on the call who are more into sort of the products, actually distributing products, I see that Alexandria at Melling Mineral Services, you've got a range of distribution offices, including in South America. It'd be interesting to flavour the discussion with what you've got as learnt experiences from different parts of the globe in terms of distribution networks, the culture. Because I think, Oliver, one of the points that you've mentioned to me in the past in managing risk is the understanding of different business cultures. What sort of examples have you seen that will sort of make you want to say, no, I need to understand this marketplace?
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial that we don't take an assumption that what works here at home, applies across the board. And we don't need to look far. I mean, you go to Europe and you will see different ways of people doing business. I mean, some extremes will be, if you look at the Far East, where business cultures and practices are considerably different to how how we do things, and navigating that as a seller, as a vendor into those types of markets, and ensuring that you're aware of cultural differences is really important. As you can imagine, I mentioned before about the markets that I was responsible for in Asia. The difference between doing business in India couldn't be more different to the difference between the way of doing business with Japan, where the way people interact with each other and the openness of information flow as well is considerably different. So it's a really important factor. It seems like a soft thing, but especially against the backdrop of contracts and the importance of getting paid. But actually, the cultural awareness is certainly an essential component of successfully trading overseas.
Yeah, and I see a number of the people who are on the call this morning are in food or medical related areas, and I suppose in a legal context, Kellsey, I'm not sure if this is one for you. There are very different rules if you're dealing with pharmaceutical products in terms of exposure to liability. Is there much of a difference between an EU-based market and a sort of North American market? What's more litigious in terms of food and enzymes and medical products? Is there a sort of theme that people should look out for?
I think the sort of core point is that the laws so the national and sort of regional laws will differ depending on which market you're in. So what you have to comply with, so from a food and drink perspective, what you have to comply with for consumers might be different in one market to what it is in the UK. And in addition, it's particularly in the pharma industry, there is a lot of medical regulation that sits alongside all of the other sort of usual legislation that you'd think of from a contractual perspective. There's also regulation around sort of imports, exports, around the sort of pharma products that you'd have to think of. So I think the sort of key message is, in that scenario, it's really important to get advice from the correct place, so from local lawyers in particular regions. So whilst we can advise in England and Wales, we're also part of, and Alex will also touch on this, that we're part of sort of a wider networks called Consulegis, the GBL Alliance, and the China Collaborative Group, where we can reach out to our network to get that local advice for you to ensure that when you hit those markets running, you are complying with local and sort of regional laws and regulation, because that's absolutely going to be vital.
Yeah, Alex, I'm going to come to you next, because one of the things I'm thinking, I'm a service-based business, and I look to sort of develop links overseas, but a bit like yourselves is to deal with the UK sort of size of what they're doing coming into the UK. But one of the things I was thinking about was the way in which COVID and this whole hybrid remote working concept has perhaps affected, and I know we've got an international translation business on the call, and they must have subcontractors or people doing work all over the place. How do you deal with somebody who sort of says, well, actually I'm quite happy, I want to stay in France, I'll do the work? What are sort of the issues that are coming out of that upheaval?
Yeah, no, we see that all the time with clients where obviously at the start of the pandemic, people were forced to work from home where they could. And that's led to this sort of general understanding that working remotely can work, and turning that 9 till 5, Monday to Friday presenteeism on its head. So I think businesses are sort of embracing that, which is great. The issue then becomes when there's a cross-border element, as we've discussed already, that and you may have a situation where somebody, through no fault of their own, has been stuck abroad. Perhaps they'd gone to see family before the pandemic kicked off, and they carried on working remotely from their country of origin. And then they've seen that actually they quite like it and they'd like to stay there. We get these questions all the time, where a client will come to me and say, Alex, so-and-so has been working in Portugal for the past 2 years. Am I compliant? Is there an issue? And understandably, they won't have looked into necessarily, where should that tax have been paid? What are the risks for an employment perspective? So I think some of the key issues and risks are that they may not have been tax compliant, or social security may not have been paid properly in the country of origin. And the risks there would be that the local jurisdiction would there could be fines levied on the employer for not having complied with those local responsibilities. That the individuals I mentioned will have, during that time abroad, will have been being able to benefit from those local labour protections as well. They may not have realised it, but at the point, and those labour protections would probably only come to light if the employer wanted to do something, so discipline the employee or end the employment relationship. So those are sort of the trigger points where those local labour protections might come to the fore. Also, just want a quick word on the Posted Worker Directive. Now, this is something that historically in the UK we've never had to worry about too much. It's a European piece of legislation, but even when the UK was still part of the European Union, it wasn't something that we implemented in the UK because we were already compliant. However, I'm digressing slightly. The bottom line is the Posted Worker Directive still applies in Europe. And what that means is that if employees are posted, i.e. they are sent abroad to work, then there are requirements in that local country, which could include registering them with a local authority as a posted worker. And the definition of being posted is being interpreted quite widely as well. So you might think that somebody asking to work from Portugal for a year isn't necessarily posted because it's them that wants to work abroad, they're not being told to work abroad. But I've seen in Spain that is being interpreted as a posted worker. So there are a whole series of different rules and regulations which could go completely unnoticed, understandably, that the employers really need to be aware of, because the risks of not complying with those specific requirements can be quite significant. They can, as I've mentioned, there could be fines, penalties levied on the employer.
In terms of this session is about sort of working overseas and identifying the pitfalls. Just Kellsey and Oliver, in terms of, I'm picking up the sense that it's almost like you need to be able to do some research. And is there like one-stop shop places that you would be going, you know, on IP issues, right? This is a good place to go and get knowledge. Or Oliver, on business, and you mentioned insolvency risk. You know, if you're looking at a country, is there a good place that you can find information about, you know, different businesses? Kellsey, I'll come back to you first. Where would businesses start to do their research on picking up what they need to be concerned about?
Yeah, so I think for intellectual property, the best place to start is the Intellectual Property Office. They have a really informative website with lots of information on there about, you know, protections and registrations in the UK, but I know they also have some pages around very specific requirements in other jurisdictions, which should help you sort of navigate that. You can also look at the World Intellectual Property Office. They are obviously a global intellectual property office, which handles registrations internationally. So if you were looking to do registrations outside of the UK, so if you were going to go into another market and you needed to register your IP there, generally that would be done through the World Intellectual Property Office. But, you know, we would always recommend you do that through an IP attorney, because they can do clearance searches, help you navigate that. So I think as a first port of call, it would be, do as much research as you can yourselves. You know, the benefit of searching Google to see if other businesses are doing similar things to you, you know, the power of Google across the world, as well as looking at good sources like the Intellectual Property Office in both the UK and, you know, the global one. And I think, you know, for GDPR as a specific one, the Information Commissioner's Office, who is the supervisory authority for the UK, has some really detailed information about international transfers of data, what you can and can't do, and the safeguards and measures that you need to consider and put in place. And then I think, you know, once you've done that work, which, you know, won't have cost you anything, you can have a look at that yourselves. You may have sort of discrete issues and questions then where you can go to a law firm or Oliver, you know, the likes, depending on what type of risk you're talking about, so that you can then have a bit more of a focused conversation and, yeah, really get the best out of what exactly you need.
Yeah. So Oliver, in terms of managing financial risk and getting a sense as to the credibility and viability of the businesses you might have as customers or distribution agents, where do you think is the best port of call for businesses to start to gather research around that?
Well, first and foremost, you need to be working with local operators, so people who are on the ground, who understand the local market, local legislation, regulations. These advantages that you can get from international insurance carriers like Atradius, but also like our peers, who have boots on the ground, analysts who can really get under the bonnet of a company and tell you this company is in good health and is able to trade, or you've got to watch out because this one is struggling. So there's certainly the insurance avenue to go down. There are obviously multiple avenues in terms of credit reference agencies that you can use, yeah, there's a whole litany of those. There's a long list of them that specialize in different geographies of the world. So yeah, I think aside from you know, the financial expertise that a company like Atradius can provide, there's also a lot of homework that you know, exporters can do.
Yeah.
And you know, referring to government support websites as well makes good sense. Trade associations as well, like this one, also networking with other peers who are trying to do similar things. It makes a lot of good sense to be doing that in order to really get a feel of the landscape.
Yeah, I think I mean, we shouldn't dismiss the fact. I mean, today's event is sort of supported by Chambers Wales, and obviously there's a huge international network of chambers of commerce, and there's the international trade team within the chamber itself. So speaking with, you know, Sarah Clifford, who looks after that side of it there, I think as a business owner myself, it's sort of like, well, where do you go to find and get some support, because it can be quite lonely. The one thing I would signpost businesses in Wales to, as all of you are, although I was wondering if Jonathan was actually in Scotland in terms of the horse products and the equine support products. So you can let me know if you're actually in Scotland today. But there is some grant funding available. I think it's through the Flexible Support Programme, which can fund training that might help your organisation to expand its market. It's all targeted at exporting. So for those of you out there who are looking for that, don't dismiss that. It's being underutilised, is my impression, talking to Welsh Government. It's not going to fund everything. I think they fund up to 50% of any training costs, but it's up to a maximum of 25,000. So I'd certainly signpost you to that in terms of, you know, okay, we've got to do our homework, we've got to do our own research, but, you know, in terms of getting people, logistics, sales teams, you know, operators, talking with distribution agents and understanding all the legalities, you know, that there might be an avenue there to explore. So I think that's really important for us to consider as well. Now, we've talked about the sort of how to and getting information, and you're getting a flavour as to, yeah, actually we have to commit to do this. What happens when things go wrong though? And how can we protect ourselves when things go wrong? So we'll start with the people side issues, and then I'll come to Oliver in terms of, you know, if financially if things go wrong. What happens, Alex? What's a UK business has got an overseas sort of, say they've got an overseas establishment, but they've got UK people working there. What sort of things can go wrong?
Yeah, so yeah, I guess one of the things to bear in mind, as I've mentioned, is that they will be benefiting from those local labour protections. So it's really, really crucial that the UK business knows what those local labour protections are, because that can be an area where things can go wrong. So if we take ending the employment relationship, I know we're obviously talking about growing and expanding in international operations, but employment contracts do come to an end, and that is one of those pinch points where you would want to be absolutely sure that you've looked at the local labour protection, you've taken local advice on how to end that employment lawfully in that country. I've seen situations where the UK company will just rely on the UK contract and follow the standard process that you might follow in the UK, which was perfectly legal, lawful, compliant, etc. But in Germany, it wasn't, and that person's brought a claim in the German courts. They may well be a UK national, but they're still pursuing their employment rights abroad. And then that makes it particularly difficult then, because you're then having to defend a claim in a jurisdiction that you're not familiar with. You'll have to either travel to that jurisdiction or instruct lawyers in that jurisdiction. It just makes that cross-border litigation element so much more difficult to deal with. And it's not just dismissals as well. It could be, as I say, other pinch points include processes that you might have ongoing during employment, so capability processes, disciplinary processes, that, or even something not contentious, so the employee wanting to take maternity or paternity leave while they're abroad, or sickness absences. So it's a whole myriad of different time points in an employee's lifetime where you just want to make sure that you are locally compliant.
And in terms, I mean, Kellsey, I often, particularly with dealing with like wealth product manufacturers, I can think of, you know, great whiskey manufacturers, for example, who've sort of said about the issues they face when their products get copied or stolen overseas. So in terms of that involvement, you know, is there genuinely stuff that people can do to protect themselves and challenge if something happens on the IP side?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things when you're considering going into another market is that generally, if you've got registered protection for your trademarks or your patents or your designs, you may have at creation look to protect them within the UK. Trademark protection, IP protection generally can be very expensive to register globally. So as a sort of SME, generally we don't see SMEs going for global protection in the beginning because of the cost of it. Whereas if that is something where you're in, you know, real looking to grow into those markets, considering your registration options in those markets is really important, because ultimately you may have registered in the UK, but there is, as Liz says, obviously the risk then that you go into another market where you don't have registered protection and someone is doing something either almost identical or very similar. And that creates a couple of issues of, you know, one, is that going to prohibit you getting into that market? Mainly because either you're not going to hit the market running because someone's already doing it, or secondly, or also considering if we do branch into this market, are we going to infringe someone else's IP because they've already registered in that market? So that is something that is very important, and IP litigation can get very expensive. And as I say, you know, the laws in that jurisdiction might be different about the ownership, the registration rights they have. How long that registration lasts for may also be different in that country than what you would expect in the UK. So there are things that you can do. And I think being very, very aware of the IP that you own and how you want to use that overseas from the beginning is important, because you can look to widen your registration as soon as possible. So, for example, in the UK, the trademark register is essentially done on a first come, first served basis. So if you want to register your trademark, whoever's going to get there first is going to get there first. And once they've got that registration, it initially lasts for 10 years, but then it can be extended. Now, if you wanted to expand that registration beyond the UK, so a lot of organisations will have protection in Europe as well as the UK, that might not be as expensive as, say, going for global protection. And there is a lot of information also, as I mentioned, on sort of the international, it's called WIPO, on the World Intellectual Property Office, that can help you navigate how you go for international protection to avoid those risks happening when you actually hit those markets. And clearance searches can be done by IP attorneys to see if there are other businesses already doing the same. And if they are, and you have registered protection, you would have every right to bring an IP infringement action against them. generally with IP infringement actions, if you send a letter, letter before action, effectively saying, you are infringing my IP, here's my registered protection, you're going to be in a fairly good position. That's not to say that they're not going to defend it and say that they're using it and you don't have registration. Where it gets considerably more difficult is if you don't have registered protection. So it's balancing the risk between the cost of registration versus the risk of having that unregistered protection and not having the benefit of being able to just bring an infringement claim and hopefully, nip it in the bud quite soon.
Because you do hear various apocryphal stories about, it just lost in the mists in terms of trying to make a claim against somebody and they just, like Phoenix traders, they just disappear and the damage has been done. So I think it is very difficult to manage all these things remotely. And what I increasingly pick up is this sense of having a team network that you can tap into and sort of can, bit like these sessions, you can pick up on bits of information and get signposts on, do your own research. But Oliver, managing finance, there's no point in having a great contract or a distribution agency if they're not going to pay you. But presumably, insurance is one of the ways of managing risk. Is that the sort of ultimate backstop when things do go, pear-shaped?
Well, there are many ways to manage, especially deteriorating risk. Clearly, when it comes to trade, if you can get cash in advance, then you're winning. But the shift that we're seeing towards businesses transacting on open account terms is not just a European or Western thing now. It's really going global, and you will be finding yourselves in a position often where you need to offer open account terms. Now, one way of mitigating that is certainly insurance, and what an insurance company will do is undertake a thorough assessment of the counterparty risk that you're looking at. So look at the buyer, their financial health, but not just the buyer themselves, but the environment that they're trading in. So understanding the local economic situation and other factors that might sort of contribute to the health or demise of that particular buyer, and give advice accordingly. So in essence, what happens then is if the buyer is unable or won't pay under the contract for a variety of reasons, you can be protected by the insurance. So that is certainly one means, and used increasingly across the globe right now. There's also an ability to, let's say, hedge your receivables through financing, and that's another avenue that companies can explore as well, where factoring companies, for instance, will assume the risk, the open credit risk, on your behalf, and they then are responsible for chasing outstanding debts. So there are options available to exporters who are seeking to mitigate the perils of not being paid, and insurance is certainly increasingly the preferred option.
Is there an insurance, just picking up on the point that Kellsey had in terms of if you have contract disputes with somebody, are there insurances that you can have to protect you against the sort of the legal fees and the costs of a claim that you might make in the Chinese courts or the Russian courts, or is it just don't waste your time? Yeah,
disputes are very difficult to cover from an insurance standpoint. Until a dispute can be assessed and proven to be spurious, for example, then it's quite challenging to put an insurance against it. It really depends on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, oh, that's interesting. We've touched a lot about working and people working around. Alex, I'm going to just come to you on this one. Some of my clients are involved in supply and installation, so they might be putting systems in place, they might be putting structures in place and going overseas and sending UK people overseas, or they might be taking on staff. Now, is it better to take on staff in that country on a self-employed basis if they have no other presence in that country? Are there any particular good ways of doing on like supply and install?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Liz. It will depend on the jurisdiction. So, for example, in Brazil, a contact of mine there is very keen on using contractors for that sort of work because of the way that the employment rights and relationships work in that particular jurisdiction. Obviously, you've got to make sure that the person you're using is a contractor. So in the UK, everyone will be familiar with that there's lots of case law about at the moment as to, is somebody actually an employee or are they actually a contractor? And if they are actually an employee, but they're putting themselves out as a contractor, then the courts have the ability to see through that, and that person would still have all the employment rights. So I would say, yes, definitely explore that, because it can often be the far more simpler way of doing business abroad. Definitely seek local advice on whether that will work and what the contractual arrangements that should be put in place. I'm conscious that's more of Kellsey's area, but you want to make sure that when you're dealing with these people that there are those confidentiality provisions, etc., in the contracts to make sure that you are protected. And also, I would say, just it's not my area, but you should double up on the advice and look at the tax side of it as well. Make sure that the tax arrangements are being done properly.
Yeah, I mean, I've got one on my desk at the moment, which is a service-based supplier here in the UK, but they accredited training services that they offer, but that they've got a self-employed person in an EU member state who puts together a little training pack with a certificate in and various small items. Now, for me, as a VAT person, I'm now worried that, well, actually, those goods are in France when they're put together and sent out to those European customers. Have I got a place of supply for VAT registration purposes in France? So you can see how very quickly, when you're trying to get a foothold, and that business has gone down that route as a result of Brexit, because its customers were just really annoyed with the way in which they're having to deal with VAT and customs duty when they receive packages from the UK. So you can see how these influencing factors take a business in a certain way and can create issues quite easily. Kellsey, I just want to come to you, because we did mention, and it's, to be honest, it's one of the banes of my life. I don't know how our people listening in on this one, but when you're trying to grow your business, you need to find out where your potential customers are. You do your research that Oliver's talked about, you find people, but how do you actually get in touch with them in order to have a conversation? Because GDPR rules, is this across the globe in terms of the strictures, or is it very much a UK EU sort of problem, shall I say?
So data protection is a global problem, not problem, but it is something that applies globally. It just applies in different ways. So the UK GDPR is derived from what was just the GDPR, which is the EU version. And when we left the European Union, it became the UK GDPR. But, for all intents and purposes, it's very similar, save for some specific anomalies in the Data Protection Act, which is a UK piece of legislation and effectively implements the UK GDPR and has more of the exceptions and the details. Now, that applies. So in the UK and the European Union, we have a very strict data protection regime, as is set out in the GDPR and each specific piece of legislation that implements that. Now, other countries will have data protection legislation, but it may not be as stringent as the UK. And there's a couple of things to think about there. So from a UK perspective, if you are going to be transferring personal data about a UK data subject, so such as myself, someone that resides in Wales, if you are going to transfer personal data about an individual to a third country, then, and that's effectively what you have to think about is it what's classed as a restricted transfer under the UK GDPR? And a restricted transfer is effectively a scenario where you are transferring personal data beyond the UK. Previously, it was beyond the European Union. And whether you have adequate protections to protect that individual's data when it leaves the UK or the European Union. So the UK and the European Union have made what are called adequacy decisions about other countries around the globe, about their data protection regimes, how thorough they are, how detailed they are. And if they have an adequacy decision, then generally the UK will deem that sufficient in order for you to transfer data to them, because they have a regime in place which is going to protect the UK citizens' personal data. Where it gets more complicated is where there isn't an adequacy decision. And actually only a handful of countries have an adequacy decision. You can find the list of them on the ICO's website. If you just type in ICO adequate countries, you'll find a list of them there. So, for example, Australia doesn't have an adequacy decision. So if you were going to, and we've got a client who wants to transfer personal data between Australia and the UK, that doesn't mean you can't transfer the data. Obviously, the world wouldn't go round if we couldn't move data. It's moving left, right, and centre as we speak. So, it's not that you can't do it. It's what you do about protecting it before it moves. So there are a number of safeguards that the ICO deem to be appropriate safeguards. One of those is what we call standard contractual clauses. So if you have a contract with the business in the other jurisdiction that you are going to transfer personal data between, you should have data protection provisions in that contract. And in addition to that, you have these standard contractual clauses, which you would include within the contract as a schedule. And they are deemed to give a level of protection because there are contractual requirements on the data importer in that jurisdiction as to what they can do with that data. And those standard contractual clauses, very helpfully, actually can't be changed. The ICO, they are what they are. Businesses have to sign up to them as they are. There are a few things that, commercial points that you can change, but ultimately the legal points you can't. So I think in a nutshell, it's always remember that, ultimately businesses have to transfer data. The UK are also going to be looking at sort of the data protection regime, particularly that we've got in relation to contacting people, marketing, cookies, things like that, which is really important in the UK. But if you look at it from an international perspective, data has to move, but it's important to make sure that when it moves, you've given those individuals the protection that they would already get under the UK GDPR effectively.
Yeah. I don't know about how our colleagues listening in are feeling, but sometimes it does feel incredibly hard to try and grow a business in terms of getting data and information and marketplaces. But I suppose you've got to be sanguine, that's life, isn't it? And you've got to be keen, and the harder you work, the easier it gets, I find, in terms of growing your business. One of the points I was looking at before we started this call was the value of Welsh exports as they sort of spread around. And of course, there was a major blip, we haven't mentioned the C word too much, but in terms of 2021. Oliver, I was just wondering if there's any particular areas of the globe that you perceive as a greater risk. So, for example, I've seen, looking at the figures for Q1 and Q2 of 2021, there's a definite uptick of exports going back into the EU. There's a sizable uptick in exports from Welsh businesses going into Eastern Europe. Outsider. I mean, are there any areas of the globe where you think actually, if you're going to have a trade strategy, you identify where the potential markets are, but if there's a balance on risk, is there anything that you might influence as to where you'd start to look first?
Thanks for the question, Liz. I think it really depends on what sort of business you're in ultimately, but if looking at Eastern Europe, what we've seen over recent years is that that part of the continent has evolved, is no longer emerging. It's certainly has been thriving. In fact, right. There are pockets. Ukraine, as an example, is an incredibly difficult place to do business, right. and certainly a difficult place to ensure you get paid.
But why is it a difficult place to do business? Is it you can't trust people? Is it there's too much regulation? They don't like foreign entrepreneurs? What's the flavour of that?
I think that's. it's down to is down to the availability of information often. So, you know, in many of the Western European countries, you know, the access to information that we have, for instance, is free flowing. So we're able to make a judgment call on the health of a company that you're trading with confidence that the information is accurate, it's up to date. In some other countries, that information isn't so readily available, and so I suppose the opaque nature of risk poses a problem, and so Eastern Europe is no longer a concern as it once was. I'm not sure if any of our attendees today are dealing with African states, but there we also see you know, a great difficulty in accessing, you know, reliable and trustworthy information, frankly. But yeah, we also see tremendous opportunities in other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, for instance, which is really growing quickly, and there are opportunities there for exporters.
Yeah, and I think it obviously varies. I mean, I see Gary Rawlings is on the call from NATIM in terms of global water and clean water and sewerage offerings, and, you know, affordable housing units. So I'm imagining, Gary, there's a bit of sort of working with NGOs and non-government organisations and perhaps government organisations in terms of that side of life as well. So I'm sure everybody's listening. I haven't seen anything in terms of questions, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat box. So people are listening rather than sort of gotten any burning platform issues, but we're coming into the last 4 minutes, so if there are any burning platform issues, now is the time to mention them. So in terms of looking ahead, because, you know, there's lots of positive opportunities. We've got, just on the businesses that are on this call today, you look at their family backgrounds, where they've come from, where they're going, their energy, their innovation. I mean, there's a number of businesses on this call that, you know, within the last sort of 10, 15 years, you wouldn't have heard of them, and now they're, you know, they're everywhere. You know, there's really positive opportunities for Welsh businesses in order to grow their overseas markets. I'm not sure if there's any final comments just before we sort of close today. You know, do you as a panelist, do you feel optimistic for your own businesses? Do you feel optimistic for Welsh businesses? Do you think we're on the up? Who wants to go on that one? Alex, you know, is it an optimistic feeling in capital law about the client work and how they're growing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're getting more and more new instructions every day. Global mobility is a huge topic that many of my clients are interested in, and I can see that now we're coming out of the pandemic that there is that appetite. People have seen remote international working work, and people really want to make that work going forward, and it just makes good sense.
Lovely. And you're optimistic? All the barriers, Kellsey, in terms of, you know, GDPR and IP, you know, there is a way we can get through this.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's always for businesses is to try and not see them as barriers as much as you can, as difficult as they are to navigate sometimes. You know, there is a reason that IP protection is there. Ultimately, if you look at it from your own business's perspective, it's there to protect you. And IP is an enormous asset, and for some businesses, it is their core asset. And in terms of strategy for growth, if people use their IP in that way, they can grow enormously across the globe by exploiting it, licensing it throughout the world. And, you know, ultimately, it's just getting it right at the beginning, and it will sort of flow through then. So, and I think, you know, with GDPR as well, you know, we have clients come to us a lot, and everyone's very worried about it. But ultimately, when we break it down, it's not too difficult to sort of navigate it through. So I think it's definitely room for optimism. I mean, just adding to what Alex said from Capital's perspective, despite COVID-19, we've seen so many clients still thriving and going into international markets. You know, we've just opened a new base in Paris. You know, there's lots happening, and there's lots of clients that are still doing this. So I think there's absolutely room to be optimistic. yeah, just cross the I's and no, that's wrong. Dot the I's and cross the T's. Yeah, and yeah.
Yeah. Now, Oliver, just on an optimistic note, you've just spent a couple of years in Hong Kong coming back, so presumably you retain that level of optimism in terms of opportunities out there.
Absolutely, and I really echo the positivity from the ladies. It's a difficult environment. We have to charter, these waters, with skill and with people and organisations that can support, and people, businesses should take advantage and use the resources available. But yeah, I absolutely feel positive, and the Atradius standpoint is also one of positivity. Our clients are thriving, and as they continue to thrive, we will continue to support them, irrespective of the insolvency environment that's coming.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, we've just got to manage risk, haven't we? We've got to understand our markets and manage risk when we move into them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much. On behalf of those who've been listening to the call today, can I thank Oliver from Atradius and Kellsey and Alex and their expertise from Capital Law. As I say, we've tried to cover people, we've tried to cover business processes, and we've tried to cover that backdrop of the managing risk landscape. So I do really hope for everybody who's joined on today, whether, Biocatalyst, Mike from MF Consultancy, Andrew from Nordic International, I hope there was something in there for everybody. Your chamber is here to help you, to facilitate and to point you in the right directions. You can see the level of expertise that you can tap in through the partnerships that the chamber has. I see Gary's just made a comment in the chat box. He's just come back from ADEX 21 in Belgium and a number of export opportunities. If we get out there, there is an opportunity that we can seize. Carpe diem, isn't it? Seize the day. Now, Sarah's put a little note on there in terms of survey. There's no poll, there's no sort of thing, but there will be a feedback. Obviously, Chambers Wales wants to make sure what events we do put on are tailored and you need and can benefit from. So, as I say, as a final thank you, it's a bit like the three Ronnies plus Liz, isn't it? Thank you to Oliver, Kellsey and Alex. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day. Bye for now.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.